Hallelujah. Let Lord Jesus Christ shine forth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. Welcome to another live stream with DCCI Ministries. It's been a very long time, and now we are able to do live stream. Actually, I'm able to do live stream. Can I just get quick confirmation if the sound and vision is all good? Once I get that confirmation, and I am going to take silent as yes, it's perfect. I'll take that as yes, and it's perfect, even though I know you haven't heard what I said because it takes apparently 20 seconds for you to hear what I say. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And also thank you very much, Phil, for being here and trying to keep people in order in the chat. So I'll just give you very basic principles for the chat, those of you who will be kind of commenting in the chat. I don't have that much rules. I gently encourage you to please do not copy and paste the same message again and again. That goes under the abusing of the chat. Once you put it, probably it will be picked up. And if you want to get my attention, please put @ in front of DCCI Ministries. If you copy and paste the same message again and again and again, I am afraid my moderators will time you out. So it is not our intention to block you, but we will time you out if you just like cross the boundaries. Abuse is not good. And please watch your language towards my guest. And please do not use the chat to share your personal information. I think that will be it. I can't remember what were the other rules, but I didn't have that much rules. So if something comes to mind, I will remind you. So tonight we've got guests. We are traveling all the way to past, to state, and we've got Brother Reasoned Answers with us. Peace of Christ be with you, brother.
Peace of Christ be with you.
How are you doing?
I am doing excellent. I am eager to talk about our Lord Jesus, give him honor by taking the Muslim claims of scientific miracles in the Quran and putting them to the test. Because after all, we should all want to know what's true.
Okay, before we do that, can you just quickly summarize who you are and what you do? If anyone haven't come across with you,
Yeah,
we will get their attention and then we pick up from that.
Absolutely. So my name is Thaddeus. My YouTube channel is Reasoned Answers. I've been involved with Christian apologetics for around 25 years, but only on a personal level. I spent a lot of time learning material for my own personal benefit and for my use in private conversations, but I never imagined that I would start a public ministry. Being very naturally introverted, being the kind of person who only likes to talk to people who I know personally, not exactly what I would plan for myself. However, the Lord had other plans, and we see this often, that he will take people who don't seem to be naturally suited for a task, and he'll call them to that task because that way he gets all the glory. If I can do a public ministry, that would suggest that I am receiving spiritual help, assuming I do a good job, of course. If I do poorly, that's all on me. But if I do well, then it is because the Lord is helping me. So through a variety of circumstances, I was watching a Christian video on YouTube, and someone recommended I check out David Wood's content. I did. I became interested in Islam. I ended up befriending Islam Critiqued, and he encouraged me to put some material on YouTube. I told him I was going to do an apologetics talk at my church, for 15 or 20 people. Basically the maximum number of people I ever talked to at one time before I start a YouTube channel. And he's like, yeah, if you're doing that anyway, you might as well record it and put it up on YouTube. So I thought about it. The Lord worked on me, put it up, and then over time he's drawn me more and more into talking about Islam.
Okay, so you spoke to largest group you spoke was 20 people, and then suddenly you end up all over social media. And I know that you set up a website called I Hate Hatun or something.
I did. So I was on David Wood's final
What's wrong
farewell
with
live
you?
stream.
What's wrong with you? I am the most loveliest person and most humble and prideful to be humble person you will ever meet. Yet you set up a website called IHateHatun.com or something.
Yeah, so let me explain the context there. David was having his final live stream, and
I don't think
people
context is gonna make this any good, brother. Title it says fix.
people were jumping on, and of course, I had offered to take over David's channel, and Hatun ended up taking it over, and then as I was about to sign off, David's like, "We'll see you at your new website, IHateHatun.com." So then I was like, well, David told me to. I got to register it. So I registered it, and then it just redirects to that portion of the video.
So I thought as a Christian you were told to love me, but I know love can't be forced. So I pray, not Lord changes my heart, but changes your heart. I thought that was so funny, brother. Okay, let's focus then. So, Mr. IHateHatun.com, brother, what is it wrong with you that you thought actually you need to check out the scientific claims of the Quran, since Quran is identified as the perfect word of Allah? It is what Allah said. Just ignore the parts when angel steps in and then speaks, or jinn steps in and speaks, and Umar confirms what Satan steps in. Ignore that part, but the rest is what Allah said. So very word of Allah. And Allah is the God of Muslims. And you decided to check out his claims. What was your intention?
Oh, well, so whenever a Muslim comes to my channel and, they leave some comment, usually doesn't even indicate they've watched the video, but whatever, doesn't matter. They leave a comment. One of the things I usually do is say, what is your best evidence that Islam is true? Trying to start a legitimate conversation where we can actually have something to discuss instead of just, insulting each other back and forth. And most of the time, unfortunately, they just ignore that. Okay, well, I mean, that's their choice, so they don't have to answer me, but they took the time to come to my channel. I'd like to hear what they have to say. But when they do respond, well, usually it's Islam is true because the Trinity doesn't make sense, or the incarnation doesn't make sense. They don't use those words generally. They put it in a more provocative way. But usually, if you know the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the incarnation, their questions are very easy to answer. So, but even if that wasn't the case, even if, they had some valid argument against Christianity, that wouldn't make Islam true. I want something that makes Islam true. I want some evidence of it. And the very rare circumstances that they offer evidence, I'd say 9 times out of 10, they say, well, the Quran contains scientific miracles, or more accurately put, scientific foreknowledge, things that a 7th century person couldn't have known, that only an all-knowing God could know. So, being generous, I said, well, let's take these claims seriously. Let's set up some objective criteria, look at these claims, see if they hold up to scrutiny. If we have 1 or 2 claims that seem to be hard to explain, that might tell us something. If we have a whole bunch, that might tell us something else. Of course, we have to weigh these against any evidence to the contrary, but at least it's evidence. Most of the time when I ask for evidence, they don't even try to give me evidence. So I decided to take their claims seriously, see if their evidence holds up to scrutiny.
And what is the kind of quickest answer? Yes, all-knowing Allah kind of tells us about science, or he destroys the science?
Well, to jump to the very end of the presentation, I think the conclusion is going to be that everything that is vaguely scientific in the Quran that Muslims point to was either common knowledge of the time or is plain false.
Okay. Well, it will be awful and heart-crushing if we see Allah actually makes mistakes when it comes to the so-called scientific claims. Okay, so let's start. What do you have? You got very nice, very nice. What do you call slide in here? This is like very beautiful picture, brother. Did you
Yeah,
make it?
so this was the thumbnail to my original video, laying out my criteria to look for scientific miracles. I did not draw this myself. I commissioned it. I had someone else draw it. But this is a picture of me back when I had a large beard.
And you had long hair.
Yes, and long hair.
So that
Taking.
means when you were younger?
Oh, well, I mean, technically I was younger, but I think it's probably about 1.5 2 years ago that this picture was drawn. And I have a microscope there, and I've got the Quran up on my microscope. I'm taking a really close look, trying to scientifically test whether it's true, because at least sometimes Muslims will tell us that the Quran has these scientific miracles. Other times, when they want to avoid what the Quran has to say, they'll say it's not a book of science. But if they're going to be consistent and it's a book of science, when they want it to be, it has to always be a book of science. Or if it's not, if it's just have its metaphors, when they try to get around the errors, well, then it's all metaphors. You can't have it both ways. So it's me putting the claims to the test.
Okay, so claim was Islam is truth because of the scientific miracles of the Quran, or scientific claims in the Quran, and we are just going to test some of them. Actually, brother is going to test some of them, and then we will see if that puts Islam as truth or as false. Go ahead, brother.
Yep, we'll start with the Muslim claim in their own words. So, we've kind of summarized it, but let's let the Muslims speak for themselves. This comes from QuranForKids.com. There's no denying that science was archaic and thoroughly outdated at the time of our prophet in comparison to the present. Certainly, there were none of today's technological marvels that aid science available in that era. There were no telescopes, microscopes, etc. in the 7th century. Therefore, what are the odds of an illiterate desert dweller like Muhammad producing the scientific miracles of the Quran? Verily, the only plausible answer is that he received a revelation from God. So I put this up here for a couple examples. Well, I certainly agree that there were no telescopes, or at least advanced telescopes or microscopes in the 7th century. People certainly had eyes. They certainly could see. So whether there was advanced scientific technology or not is not going to be relevant. I mean, we need to take that into account, yes. If it does say something that requires a telescope, well, that would be something. But the mere fact that there were no telescopes doesn't mean other things are automatically miraculous. But I went to this website for kids because I wanted to emphasize that this is, critics of Islam, non-Muslims in general, they easily dismiss these claims. They look at them and they say, what in the world are you talking about? The text says nothing like what you're claiming it says. But in the Islamic world, this is a very important thing. This is something they teach kids from a very young age. One of the few things they can point to try to give some sort of intellectual background for the religion. So there's kind of this disparity that, non-believers look at the claims and they're just so often so ridiculous that they just dismiss them without any thought. Which, I mean, is valid, right? It's valid from a personal standpoint. But we're kind of losing the battle by not addressing these things directly. That they are important to Muslims, and often this is one of the main things that they look to as giving them confidence in their religion. So by directly addressing the claims, I think we more thoroughly can refute Islam than if we just say, yeah, that's ridiculous. And plus your God believes that stars are tiny objects he throws at demons, which is a valid critique, but it's still not addressing the belief directly.
So from very early age, Muslim kids are kind of taught to believe that Quran contains scientific miracles. So there are scientific informations which Muhammad wouldn't know in his time. There was no way to find that information, yet it's in the Quran. Therefore, Quran is from Allah. So they are brainwashing the kids from very early age.
Yes,
Such a shame.
exactly.
Such a shame.
And I also have a claim oriented towards adults here, just to prove that it's not just for kids that they say this stuff.
Yeah,
The Quran itself.
Think about it, brother. So from very early age, when you kind of hear from everyone, Quran is from Allah because it contains scientific claims. And then next stage you hear the same thing. All your childhood you hear the same thing. So when you turn 15 at school, when they tell you actually, no, that is not true, you wouldn't believe your teacher because everyone from young age told you.
Yeah.
So-called scientific miracles.
Yeah, plus you have the defense of course, non-Muslims being liars and treacherous and haters of Islam. So automatically not believable.
And then now, so not only kids, but now even the adults are being taught the same thing.
Yes, I don't have a survey in mind, but I would say a strong majority of Muslim adults believe the same thing, that the Quran contains this amazing scientific knowledge. This comes from Umar Nasser on the website Rational Religion. He writes, the Quran itself demonstrates its divine origin. One of the ways it does this is through a description of scientific phenomenon. God knowing that
Go
ahead.
Just a second. Title of the website is Rational Religion.
Yes, that's what he named his website.
Okay, sorry, start from the beginning, brother, sorry.
Sure. The Quran itself demonstrates its divine origin. One of the ways it does this is through its description of scientific phenomenon. Now, listen to his claim here. God, knowing that atheist scientists in this age would lead people astray, revealed verses that detail major scientific phenomenon. From the tongue of the Prophet Muhammad, an illiterate man in the Arabian wilderness, came descriptions of natural phenomena that have only now been confirmed. Ancient Muslims either accepted these verses literally or, being unable to understand their physical reality, interpreted them metaphorically. However, in today's age, we have seen their truth confirmed. So there's a couple interesting things here. And we'll kind of see that I'll have all the claims I'll be taking directly from Muslims, in their own words. And we'll see this over and over again, that they make this effort to make Muhammad look as incapable as possible. They emphasize that he was illiterate. They emphasize that he lived in the desert, that he didn't have, access to great technology, that kind of thing. And it's actually irrelevant, right? Well, first of all, the evidence may suggest that Muhammad could read and write, but let's just give him that he's illiterate. That's irrelevant. An illiterate person is not any less intelligent than anyone else. They're not any less capable of hearing knowledge passed on orally and repeating it. They're not any less capable of observing things and drawing conclusions about the world. Plus, if these were really miraculous knowledge that no one knew, it wouldn't matter. He could be the most educated person in the world, and if no one knew it in the 7th century, it wouldn't matter. He still wouldn't know it. So they're kind of they're showing that they need some basis to puff up their claims, make them look better. They don't stand on their own. And then the other interesting part here is he's basically admitting in this last sentence, without admitting it, that early Muslims didn't see these scientific miracles. They didn't draw these conclusions because the verse doesn't actually teach what the modern Muslim's going to claim. Anything you want to add?
No, I'm just still focused on the title of the website. When you travel to the parts of the world where education is not that much promoted, or the level of education is very low, you get to see how people are creative. Like, I met people who couldn't read and write, yet they invented something and then they made lots of money from their invention. Yes, I agree with you. Someone maybe who couldn't read and write, for the sake of the argument, still would able to observe the stars. still would able to observe where the baby comes from, those very much basics. And also maybe it might be helpful to remember the claim truthfulness of Islam. Like Allah doesn't say in the Quran is from Allah or Islam is true because of the scientific claims. You need to produce a book like that, chapter like this, or you need to find much contradictions in it if it is not from Allah. So that's like kind of overall argument. It is such a shame that 21st century, where people have access to technology, access to medical science, or any type of science, still believe Quran contains scientific miracles, and then say like today, in today's age, we have seen their truth confirmed. Like I really
definitely.
What is that?
I mean, the Quran's main claim for itself is that it's irreproducible. No one could create a surah like it. And yet, I had studied Islam for a good amount of time before I even came across with any Muslim offering that argument. It's almost like they know it's not a very good argument, so they have to come up with something better than what their God could come up with.
Say something about Islam already.
So continuing on, I want to also ask this question: why should Christians care about this subject? As I kind of already alluded to, non-Muslims usually just see the claims and they're like, this is so silly. Why would anyone believe this? And then they don't have any interest in addressing them. However, the idea that science proves the Quran has been ingrained into Muslims from a very young age, and it's also important to a lot of adults. And as kind of alluded to, there aren't many arguments for Islam. Muslims won't usually shy away from defending the Quran's own claim to its miraculous nature. Muslims will say that Muhammad was a perfect human being who, was a perfect moral example, which wouldn't make Islam true even if it was true. And of course, it's so easily proven false by just looking at Muslim sources. They'll say that Islam is the fastest growing religion, but of course that has no bearing on truth either. So there's really not a lot they can point to. So by addressing one of their main arguments that they at least like to use internally, it really has an effect because there's not a lot it stands on. I mean, really, it mostly just stands on authority. Someone I trust told me it's true, therefore it's true. But as long as someone believes that there is, scientific evidence in the Quran, that it's miraculous, no human being could have written this, then a lot of the other arguments aren't going to have much effect. We point to the moral failings of Muhammad, and someone could say, well, the Quran comes from God. God endorsed Muhammad. So whatever Muhammad did, no matter how I feel about it, it must be right because God endorsed it. Anything you want to add about why we should care?
I think we should care because it keeps lots of Muslims in Islam. Actually, something just came to my mind. Just a second, brother.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was last year when part-time stripper from Islamic Dawah gangs made a survey. He was asking, what would cause you to have doubt in your religion? And then I think 20% of the people who took part in survey stated scientific arguments. So that was causing Muslims to have doubt in their faith. Why? Because as you showed us a little bit earlier, from very young age, they are told that Quran is from Allah because it contains scientific miracles. When they grown up, they've got like this amazing website called, was it called Rational Truth or something?
Rational Religion, yes.
Yeah, Rational Religion website tells scientific miracles, scientific claims are confirmed by today's science. So when people kind of hear that, in their mind is like, wow, that must be true. Lots of people don't even bother to check. So, and they stuck in Islam. And heart of Lord Jesus Christ is people to turn to him in repentance. Therefore, as a Christian, I think Even though we think that's just stupid, silly argument, we need to take that seriously and then come up with proper response instead of just ignoring and not giving attention.
Yeah, and just to add to what you're saying, that atheists will bring up these things, and we don't want Muslims to leave Islam and become atheists. That doesn't gain them anything.
They will be staying in hell with Muhammad.
Yeah, exactly. They're still under the same satanic forces as long as they are outside of Christianity. So we want to, offer Muslims something that's a good alternative, not just let the atheist handle this argument and then the Muslim leaves Islam because they think that science is the answer. Science is not the answer either. So continuing on here, before we start evaluating it, we need to ask this question: does it even matter? If it is true that there are scientific claims in the Quran that would be unknowable, would that be valid evidence for Islam? And I'm going to say yes here. If the Quran actually contained what's claimed, that it actually contained advanced scientific knowledge, that would be evidence of its divine authorship. Maybe not definitive evidence, one piece by itself, not definitive, but it definitely would be a piece of evidence. And I think it kind of works the same way as prophecy. If someone has a prediction about a future event, you have to evaluate it. If I predict what I'm going to eat for breakfast tomorrow, well, that you're probably not going to say I got that divine knowledge there. But if I make a prediction about something that's going to happen 200 years from now, and then it comes true exactly as I said, well, then you would wonder how I came to know that. Same idea with in theory, advanced scientific knowledge being in the Quran. However, we can't stop there. We need to also look at the other statements of the Quran. We need to look at everything it's claimed. And if we find obvious scientific errors, then we'll say, well, even if I can't come up with an explanation off the top of my head for why that, and how someone came to know that in the 7th century, if this is the literal speech of God, it can't have these scientific errors either. So, you kind of need to weigh both. And what people will often do is they'll just point to the errors, which is valid. It's a piece of evidence we need to look at. But I think we also want to address the positive claims, not just counteract them with negative claims. But what we need is objective criteria to test against. Because human beings have a miraculous ability to read what they want to read into a text. They will see something that is not there, which as we go along, we're going to see that is what a lot of these claims end up being based on. That someone looks at the text, they see something that the original author never intended them to see because it's not there. So we need some criteria if we're going to test this. We can't just say, if I said something, in 200 years, men are going to walk around in circles, okay? And then by chance, 200 years from now, there's a major event where a bunch of people walk around in circles. You would say, well, was that really a prophecy? Did you really foresee that? Or did he just say something vague and it happened to come true? So you need objective criteria to test it. What do you think about this principle?
I'm not sure if I fully agree with you, but let me bring attention to something. Bring your attention to something. I'm just going to kind of put the comment in question form. So you look at Muslim majority countries, okay? Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and lots of others. And you get to see science, like they import people as a scientist in their country, and they've got like lots of Western or Chinese scientists who works for them. Still, they seem they're not in the same level what is happening around the world or Western countries. So if the Quran contains scientific informations, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the level of development in Muslim majority countries?
Yeah, I think that, if the Quran actually contained these scientific claims, then there's a real mystery as to why it took non-Muslim Westerners to find the science. If it actually claimed that the universe was expanding, which is one of the claims we'll look at today, why did it take a Western scientist to propose the continual expansion of the universe? Why weren't Muslims saying this? Likewise, if the Quran is a book of science and Muslims are the best scientists, how come none of the Nobel Prizes in science go to Muslims?
Wow, there is none?
I believe so. There are some Muslims have won Nobel Prizes, but I believe they're all in liberal arts. I don't believe there's any in hard sciences. But let's just say I'm mistaken, and there's a couple. At 0.1%. Muslims are 20% of the world's population, and they're producing 0.1% of the top scientists. Something doesn't match up here.
And probably they are studying in western part of the world.
No doubt. And the Muslims doing science are probably very liberal Muslims that most Muslims would consider non-Muslims in any other context.
Probably. Okay, so do you have examples that you tested?
Yes. So we have we have 4 claims that we'll look to today, time allowing. But first we need to establish some criteria to evaluate these. What the Muslim will want to do is they'll want to go to the text, and then they're going to want to read whatever they say into it and then make you disprove that's what it says. So we need some criteria to actually evaluate these. And to demonstrate this, I have a little story here, reading from an ancient creation text written before the time of Muhammad. May the water be taken away, emptied out, so that the plate of the earth may be created. May it be gathered and become level. Then they called forth the mountains from the water. Straightway the great mountains came to be. And then I pull up a scientific paper, and it says the Earth's continental land masses created in short, fast bursts, scientists say. And I say, well, this kind of sounds like that text. It said, one, the author of this text knew that the land emerged out of the water. And two, the author of this text knew that it took place in a short period of time. Of course, geologically speaking, a short period of time is millions of years. But I think it works at least as well as the typical Muslim claim. If this was a passage in the Quran, no doubt there would be Muslims claiming that this was a scientific miracle, that the author knew this information, which wasn't discovered until December 2000, or at least that's when this particular article was written. What do you think? Do you think that this sounds on the same level as the scientific claims of the Quran?
Need to think about this. It needs a lot of thinking, brother. It's just wrong. Anyway, let's go.
Yes.
I want to see the examples. I can't wait for the examples because, so you said you got 4 examples, and I am sure that those 4 examples is going to help some of us to say Shahada.
Yes, I think so when we look at the scientific knowledge of the Quran. I think that this claim sounds as good as the Quran, perhaps better than the claims made about the Quran, but it's from the Popol Vuh, which is the ancient Mayan creation account. So unless the Muslims going to claim that the Mayans were true Muslims, they're going to have to reject this claim. And then if they're going to reject that claim, then how do we know that their claims stand up to scrutiny? So we need some criteria.
I was gonna say this is better than Quran, but I didn't want to hurt the feelings of the Quran, so I want to
Well, the Quran is a sentient being, or at least it's going to become one in the last days. So definitely don't want to hurt its feelings. So the first criteria is that the insight must actually be true. Seems kind of a duh. If it's not true, it can't be a scientific miracle. But sadly, it needs to be said because I've seen lots of claims of scientific miracles where they don't even have correct science. They're claiming it's miraculous that the Quran matches up with the science, and then the science is incorrect. The second criteria is that the supposed insight must go beyond what one could discover with careful observation using the 7th century technology. So if someone in the 7th century could see something with their own eyes, no need for a microscope, telescope, they could observe it in their surroundings, well, that doesn't require any miraculous insight. Criteria 3, claimed knowledge must be new to the Quran. As we're going to see, the claims that are at least vaguely true in the Quran, well, they all seem to have been given in prior texts. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Muhammad or the author of the Quran knew those texts and was reading them and repeating them. Muslims often try to get around this by saying that, oh, it doesn't matter if Galen knew about embryology hundreds of years prior. Muhammad couldn't have read Galen. Well, it does matter because it demonstrates that a human being could come up with this information. It doesn't have to be a direct influence. It's possible that it was an influence, that it was known in the culture and people were telling the stories, or it could just be that two human beings had the same conclusion based on using their eyes. But the point being is, if a previous human said it, it's obviously not miraculous that a different human being said it, unless you want to claim that previous human was also a prophet of Allah, I suppose. Number 4, and this is where the miracle happens, so this is the trickiest one. The Quran must actually say what the apologist claims that it says. So, looking at the text itself, there are responsible ways to exegete a text. It is a science, so to speak, that it's not just, completely arbitrary what someone says that a text means. But it is at least, a little bit subjective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what the early tafsir say. If the Quran actually says something, and it's perfectly clear, like it claims it to be, then surely at least some Muslims would see that in the text before a Western scientist made the scientific discovery to begin with. It doesn't necessarily mean every single tafsir has to agree, but at least someone has to say it. If it's perfectly clear and the text actually says it. And then finally, it has to go beyond a lucky guess. So if it would be impossible for someone to know something, but there's only two possibilities, well, guessing the right one isn't really that impressive. Even if you couldn't definitively know it using 7th century technology, if there's only 2 possibilities and you guess right, well, anyone could guess right at one time. Now, if it stacks up and you have 20 different things that were, like flipping a coin and you guessed right, well, that would mean something. So it's not that it rules it out. It's just that it's insufficient knowledge on its own if it looks like it could easily be a lucky guess. So we'll dive into examples after this, but what do you think of these criteria? Do you think that they are reasonably objective? Do you think that these are ways to separate someone's imagination from what the Quran actually says?
I think your criteria are fine. I just have a problem with the number 4 because that's hard.
Yes.
The Quran does actually say what is Dawa Gansasing. That's hard. So people might reject that, but 1, 2, 3, and 5 seems to be all right.
Yeah, well, fortunately, everything usually fails at least 2 of these criteria. So, but it's good to have some sort of criteria so that we can at least, have something to talk about. Because as long as the Muslim says, well, I think it means this, so it means that, then that's not really anything that we can talk about. So our first miracle is the miracle of the seas not mixing. Are you familiar with this miracle, Hatun?
Yes, I am. Even I was once told I need to go and check it out as well. But so now we are going to go and look at those examples. So, not examples, but those miracles.
Yes.
I know there are some Mr. Muslims in the chat. So we would love to hear your rebuttals and then help us to understand and how to make this miracle magical or something. So please jump in the topic which we are discussing and then help us to understand. So we've got our first example from Surah 55, verse 19 to 20.
Yes. So I'll just put the Sahih International up. Of course, we know that translations aren't always super honest, but Sahih International is the most popular, so I'm happy to just go with it for this purpose. He released the two seas meeting side by side, added by the translator. You'll see why they added that. Between them is a barrier, neither of them transgresses. The claim of the miracle here, from a website, The Mohammedan Way, interesting name for their website. These verses refer to two bodies of water, one salty and one sweet water, which meet but do not transgress or mix together. Two bodies of water have between them a barrier. A cup of salt water and a cup of sugar water will mix together when poured into a container. 2 cups of salt water will mix together very easily when combined, as they contain the same solute. Yet, this verse of the Quran says that the two bodies of salt water do not mix. The prophet is describing a barrier, like the border of a country, which neither body of water can encroach upon or transgress. One would expect a huge body of water like the Atlantic Ocean to overrun the much smaller Mediterranean, yet researchers have found that their waters do not mix. He goes on to describe how the fish of the Atlantic Ocean do not cross into the Mediterranean, and he says that if a fish comes out of the Atlantic Ocean into the Mediterranean accidentally, it will become ill. The water of each ocean does not cross the invisible barrier between them. Rather, when they came to the border and descend and go back, not crossing. So the picture he's painting is that, the waters are approaching each other, and then, something's stopping them, and then they turn around and go back the way they came.
Okay.
He does say that.
Can
Go
I
ahead.
ask a clarification question, brother?
Yes.
So, you've got salty water and not salty water. They
Yes.
are not mixing. Both of them has their own fish, okay? Fish miss A, fish miss B, fish miss C, and fish miss D on one side. So 2 fish in this side, 2 fish in this side. They are different from one another. The moment they are kind of come to the edge of the water, they know, fish do know, that's the edge of the water. If their nose pass through other side, they won't survive. And
That is the claim.
Yeah, and then therefore they just turn their way back. I love
Yep.
those. I love those clever fish. Even though I was told fish don't have that much memory, but I really love how clever they are. They know the boundaries. They know which sea they are citizenship.
Yeah, and not only the fish, the water also knows, or at least is prevented from crossing, that it turns around too. That's the claim that he's making.
That's
usually,
Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah, he specifically has signaled out the Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean, which is super common. That's usually the example they go to. Muslim apologists don't have a lot of creativity. They all just copy the same example. But in principle, it would be true on where any two bodies of water meet, at least according to the Muslim claim. You see this picture up here in the corner. This picture is often passed around. This is a real picture. It's not doctored, but we'll get to what the picture actually is showing. And they'll say, see, here's visual proof of the waters not mixing. Our friend there on the Mohammedan Way goes on. He makes a second similar claim, but slightly different, about 2553. And it is he who has released the two seas, one fresh and sweet and one salty and bitter, and he placed between them a barrier and prohibiting partition. Now, to me, this sounds like it's describing the exact same thing as the other verse, but this particular Muslim says that this is making a different, similar but definitely distinct claim. He says that the fresh water is found in smaller bodies of water, such as rivers or lakes, while the large oceans and seas are salty. Although the enormous salt oceans could easily overrun the sweet fresh water of rivers, for some reason, They cannot encroach on the rivers, and the two waters do not pass the barrier between them. The saltwater fish do not go into the freshwater river, and the same is true of the freshwater fish. Neither can survive in the environment of the other, as was mentioned also for the two bodies of saltwater. The case of salmon and steelhead trout, which are conceived and born in freshwater and then spend most of their life in their oceans, only to return to their place of birth and mate and die, are exceptions whose rarity and uniqueness only go to prove the rule. So he actually undermines his own claim. He says that fish cannot pass this barrier, and he says, but some fish do. But, there's not that many of them, so it still counts. So before we start evaluating this claim here, so there's two distinct claims. One is that two seas or large bodies of water don't mix with each other. So, Atlantic Ocean doesn't mix with the Pacific Ocean. Atlantic Ocean doesn't mix with the Mediterranean Sea, that kind of thing. And then the distinct claim is that rivers and oceans don't mix. So any thoughts, or should we just dive into evaluating the criteria?
I'm just amazed by the knowledge of the fish. Some of them are not that clever. They seems like adventure or risk, versus others are like, no, I like to stay in my safety zone. I am amazed the cleverness or consciousness of fish as well as water. I love to hear your result of your test. I'm sure you already take a ferry and then went to Atlantic Ocean and then traveled to Mediterranean Sea and then did selfie or just deep dive and then had a picture with the fish on the salty side with another picture with the fish on sweet side and then say cheese or something. I don't know. I'd love to see some evidence, brother.
Yeah. So we'll look at that in a second. But first, I did want to say that this isn't a claim that Muslims give to non-Muslims very often, but I found that it is one that's super important to Muslims. Some of these claims they'll use in their conversation with non-Muslims. This one they don't usually bring up. They keep this one internally. But when I was researching the topic, I ended up studying this one because someone made a specific request about it on my channel. They're either a Muslim who was thinking about leaving Islam, or they were an ex-Muslim who was thinking about going back. I forget the exact details, but they're right on the fence. And this was the one verse that was really giving them trouble because they couldn't understand how the Quran could contain this miraculous knowledge. So I started investigating it, and I would come across videos that were, just scientific videos talking about salt water, and there'd be Muslims in the comment section saying this proves the Quran, even though the video had nothing to do with Islam, it wasn't analyzing the claim or anything. So I found that this is a really important claim to Muslims. There's a video on YouTube with over 2 million views on this claim, which is perhaps the most of any scientific miracle video that I've come across anyway. So definitely an important claim to the Muslim.
Okay, that means if they deceive 2 million people, that means we've got to go there and then take a selfie.
Well, I didn't travel there and take a selfie, unfortunately. But we will go through our criteria. So our first criteria was, is the claim true? Is it scientifically accurate, or does it match the current scientific consensus? And unfortunately for the Muslim, the answer here is that it really doesn't. That there aren't any real fixed barriers between seas. There is a meeting point, but at this meeting point, the waters are mixing together. And that meeting point isn't constant. It changes over time based on the tides and the rotation of the earth and storms and all kinds of things. They change the barrier point over time. The viral picture that we looked at previously, and they used that one or a couple others that look very similar. It's always a picture of the same thing, though, because it's the only place in the world where you can see this dramatic color differentiation, and that's in the Gulf of Alaska. Because of the glaciers melting, there's a lot of glacial runoff into the ocean. And since the glaciers have a lot of sediment in it, they produce a very different color water than what's in the ocean. In that still photograph, it looks like a really well-defined line because it's from a point in time. But if you look at a video clip of the same thing, you'll see that the line is constantly moving back and forth as the rate of melting of the glaciers changes. And of course, the waters are mixing at that point. That's just the point where the glacial runoff is no longer strong enough, and it begins to sink underneath the other ocean water. But they are melting, they are mixing together. There's no fixed barrier there at all. And then we have to ask this question: why do the Muslims always signal out the Mediterranean Sea? And I don't think that there's really a definitive answer. I think most likely the real answer is that the first Muslim to make this claim used it as an example, and then it just keeps getting repeated. But since they single out the Mediterranean Sea, we're going to take a look at that particular location as we go along. Continuing on whether it is true or not, we have this picture here at the bottom, which is found on hundreds of different Muslim websites. They have added the colors. They've added the darker blue and the lighter blue to try to paint a picture of what's going on. None of them seem to know where this picture comes from, but I managed to track it down. It comes from a 1970s textbook, and the caption of the image in the original textbook is something about how evaporation predominates over precipitation and runoff in the Mediterranean basin. So the author of the text is saying that because of the nature of the Mediterranean Sea, more water is evaporating out of it than is being added from rainwater and river runoff. Because of this, it creates a kind of a natural vacuum that pulls in the Atlantic Ocean water. And he goes on to describing this exact photograph that the Muslim has used as evidence for their claim. The water must enter through the Strait of Gibraltar from the Atlantic to replenish the loss from evaporation. Water is driven through the strait as a powerful current at 4 kilometers per hour. So our impenetrable barrier is actually being penetrated constantly by a powerful current at 4 kilometers per hour, according to the diagram that the Muslim has brought to us. So up at the top, you see the Atlantic Ocean water coming in, and a much smaller amount of Mediterranean seawater seeping out into the Atlantic Ocean. The author just drew this to illustrate that how the mixing is occurring. He was in no way saying that they aren't mixing. The Muslim adding the color made it look like they're not mixing, but that's not what the author of the text was saying at all.
So it is not true. It is not true that salty water and sweet water doesn't meet.
Correct. It is not true. We do still have the river claim, which we'll get to in a second. But just to provide a second illustration from a modern picture of the ocean currents. This is taken from a map of all the currents in the ocean. It'd be hard to see at small size, but you can always blow this up later on your computer or whatever if you're watching on a phone. There are dark arrows, solid arrows that are the surface level currents, and then there's dotted arrows that are the undersea currents, and they show the same thing. They show water entering from the Atlantic Ocean on the surface and a weaker current underneath the surface going out from the Mediterranean, just like the illustration from the textbook. But what about those river waters? That there was a second claim there that rivers do not mix with seas. And sometimes Muslims will provide a visual picture of that as well. They'll go to a picture like this one where heavy rain has occurred, so that the water is muddied, so it has a strong coloration. And they'll say, look, the river water is entering the ocean or the bay, whatever, and it's not mixing. Well, all you gotta do is zoom in a little and look closely, and you'll see that even in the picture itself, you can tell that the mixing is occurring. Yeah, the river current is strong. So the mud doesn't mix instantaneously, but it is certainly mixing. And even ignoring the picture, just common sense should tell you that rivers and seas mix. The river enters the sea. What do you think happens? Do you think that the river water just somehow, I don't know, goes underneath the ocean, never mixes, then comes back up somewhere else? I mean, what do you think is happening, Muslims, when you claim that the river isn't mixing with the sea? If there's actually some sort of barrier preventing the river from mixing, then either the ocean water would be being pushed further out to sea all the time, or the water would be flooding back onto the land. The water has to go somewhere. So yeah, they mix. And the Muslim tried to make this verse about animals, which aren't mentioned in there. He talked about the fish. They're not mentioned. In fairness, Muslims don't usually bring up the fish. They usually just talk about the water, but this guy did. No animals mentioned in this verse. And then he contradicts himself by pointing out salmon contradict his example. Finally, Muslims will try to point to estuaries. Estuaries are mixing points of rivers and oceans, freshwater and saltwater, where because of the physical properties of the land, there isn't immediate mixing. Often there's a bend in the river or something, so the current's not very powerful. And when it gets to the ocean, there'll be a period of water where it is kind of in between being fresh and salt, called brackish water, that has a lower salinity than the sea, but higher salinity than fresh water. And this picture comes from that same textbook, so no doubt borrowed by the same deceptive Muslim. And he's trying to pretend that, this picture is showing that there's different types of water and they're not mixing with each other, and that this is some kind of miracle. But what the picture is really showing with these little arrows is showing, oh look, the fresh water mixes, and the further out to sea you get, the more salty it is. Little by little, the more further out you get, the more they've mixed, because the mixing isn't instantaneous, but they're mixing. So further out you get, the more mixing has occurred. Anything you would like to add here?
Well, I thought there was something we would make sense, or we would kind of, not sense. I thought there would be something that we could say, yes, this is what Allah means. He's the evidence. Or we would have something we could say, this is what the Muslim apologists are saying today, which Allah confirms in the Quran. Here's the evidence. But you just disappointed me.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm trying to be as fair to the Muslim as possible. I tried to find a good representation of the argument, but unfortunately, they usually just make the claim and don't provide any evidence for it, or they provide, that little graph there looks like some evidence, and then you go to the actual source of it, and it's saying the exact opposite of what they claim it's saying. Sometimes they'll say that Jacques Cousteau proved this, which is utter nonsense. He said no such thing. So, they say things, but they don't tend to be true, unfortunately.
No good.
But you did ask, for some evidence of what Allah is actually saying.
Yes.
So let's jump ahead to what I called the fourth criteria. What does the Quran actually say? And I'm going to go to the classical tafsir. I look at Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, and Al-Qurtubi. I didn't just randomly pick these. These are generally the most respected ancient commentaries to Muslims. Now, if a Muslim wants to provide some other commentary, I'm fine with that. They can provide a different tafsir if they want, but it has to be an ancient commentary. It has to be before the time that the information was known, before the time of the scientific miracle claim, because otherwise it's just the modern Muslim pretending the text says something. So what is the barrier? Well, Ibn Kathir says the barrier is dry land. That's all he says about it, and that there's fresh water in lakes, there's salty water in the ocean, and Allah in His wisdom provided dry land to separate them. Al-Tabri offers that possibility, and then he offers a couple other possibilities. He says that the barrier might be the separation between the sky and the land. So this would be drawing upon the ancient belief that outside of the Earth's atmosphere, of course they won't use that term, but outside of the observable Earth, it's surrounded by water. That the Earth is sitting in a pool of water, and all around it is water, and that there's some sort of barrier that protects us from the flow of water, and maybe it's permeable and a little bit of water comes through as rain, or maybe it's a miraculous act to let rain through. Either way, the idea being that space is literally filled with water. So that's what he's alluding to there when he makes that claim as to what the separation is. And then he offers a third interpretation, and that's that this is a metaphor for sweet and salty people, or put differently, agreeable people and disagreeable people. And then Kurtubi says the same options as Al-Tabri. But what none of them said is that this is about some invisible barrier between two oceans, or that this has anything to do with rivers entering the sea. So it seems that the ancient commentaries don't appear to agree with our modern Muslim friends.
Am I right to, in that case, assume while Quran is supposed to be well detailed, well explained, been interpreted by 21st century Muslim missionaries or Dawah gangs by making a claim that salty water and sweet water is not going to cross one another, it's not going to mix. Yet you went back and then look at the earliest commentaries of the Quran, the people who try to explain to you the well-detailed, explained word of Allah, such as Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, and Qurtubi. Yet you noticed they're not talking about the sea is not crossing salt water and sweet water, but it might be talking about dry land, or it might even be talking for metaphorical for sweet and salty people, as well as skies and the land. Even the early Muslim commentaries are not very clear about what Allah tried to say a couple of centuries before that.
Yeah, and this is what we're going to see with all of the examples that I have, is that the tafsir don't seem to know what the verses mean. But whatever interpretations they offer for the perfectly clear, explained in detail Quran never seems to be the same as the modern Muslim offers. So I guess there's two possibilities. One is that the Quran is perfectly clear and it doesn't actually claim what the modern Muslim claims, in which case they have no scientific miracle, or that the Quran is not perfectly clear and it claims what the modern Muslim pretends it means, in which case the Quran is lying when it says it's perfectly clear. Not a lot of great options there for the Muslim. But let's say that these tafsir here are correct. One possibility, so they offered three different possibilities. The possibility that's separated by dry land. Well, that's true. At least it's scientifically true, unlike the claims that the modern Muslim was trying to make about two different seas not mixing. It's also very easily observable, however. Anyone with eyes can see that there are lakes that don't connect to the ocean. If it's talking about the separation between skies and land, as Andrew Martin in the chat is a big fan of that theory. When I first gave this argument, he gave a pretty good argument as to why that's what the Quran is actually talking about. But if that's what it's talking about, well, then it's just simply false, because space is not filled with water. So that doesn't look so good for the Muslim. And then finally, if it's a metaphor, well, there's nothing to test. It's just a metaphor. So, we got the modern Muslim claim, which is false. Dry land, true, but easily observable. The separation between the sky and the land, false. Metaphor, not a scientific statement, nothing to test. So, yeah. So in context, like I say, Andrew Martin made a good argument for the sky and space, but I think there's also a good argument to be made for dry land, because if you actually look at this verse in the context of the Quran, it's in a long list of readily apparent signs, and no one points to any of the other signs in the text as being, miraculous knowledge. What the text is kind of trying to do is say, look at all these things, all the good ways the world is organized. These are all signs of God's wisdom. And I think that, this is a reasonable interpretation, because every time the two seas are mentioned, it's always the two seas. It never says two seas don't meet. So it seems to think there's only two. And there are only two types of water, essentially. And, for important purposes, there's only two different types for human usage purposes, let's put it that way. For the purposes of human usage, there's only salt water, which is not able to be used to drink, and fresh water, which is. So then, it's true, but it's just something that not only is readily apparent, the verse only makes sense if it's telling you something you already know. So that's what I would say about the verse. I think that it's probably, talking about the dry land or talking about the barrier between the sky, which in theory people also knew, even though it's false. But either way, not any kind of miraculous knowledge or scientific claim.
I'll bring up you a question.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to the rain over the oceans if it doesn't mix?
Good question for the Muslim believer in this. I suppose that the rainwater would just kind of sit on the surface of the ocean and just kind of stay there until it evaporated. That'd be my guess.
Or rain, it's only rain is the rain salty or sweet?
So rainwater will always be fresh. Yeah, sweet.
It just wait there, or just rains onto the part where it is not salty.
Yeah, that could be. That could be. Maybe there's no rain over the ocean, except maybe. There is.
I think that's better. Yeah, there is never rain.
Some sort of miraculous work of Allah there, that even though the rainwater over the ocean appears to be fresh water, it must actually be salty water so that they can mix.
Yeah, I think they separate the moment when it's about to reach the water, which is salty. Then all the salty rain will go that side, and then all the sweet rain will go to other side of the ocean.
Yeah, that must be it.
Yeah.
So we can just invent more miracles as we go along. Whatever number of miracles we need to explain the text, that's how many miracles the text contains.
Yeah, that's miracle by itself.
Exactly. What other text could you do this with? So then we have to ask the question, is this miracle observable? Obviously, we've already shown that since the claim wasn't even true to begin with, it obviously fails. But let's go through all the criteria anyway. And our second criteria was, is it observable? Is this something that a 7th century person who was carefully looking at the world could determine for themselves? So if the verse means what I propose that it means, that it's dry land, yes, they could observe that. And anyone with eyes can see that there are lakes that don't enter the ocean. Even if that's not the case, even if it is what the Muslim claimed, it's still observable. You can go to the coast during a time of heavy rain, and you can see, just like that photo I provided, that the muddy rainwater is not immediately and completely mixing with the ocean. And even ignoring that, it's observable by fishermen as well. You say, well, how could you know about something that's way out, not on the coast? Well, someone in a boat, they would feel the effect of the ocean currents on their boat, and they would find a particular place where it felt like there was multiple currents working in different directions. And sometimes there's a slight color differentiation, not like in that photo that we provided. But sometimes there's a slight observable color difference, or sometimes there's air bubbles where the two conflicting currents are meeting. Sometimes you can kind of see ripples on the waves from it. So it's observable. However you stack it, it is observable. So could a 7th century person determine this? Yes, they could. So no miracle on that front. Our third criteria was, is this original to the Quran? I.e., had any human being proposed this knowledge which was apparent, which according to the Muslim was unknowable before the time of Muhammad. So if a human being proposed this before, well, that kind of undermines the claim. So is it original? No, it's not. People have basically, since the beginning of time, known that there's a difference between salt and fresh water, that they have distinct natures. Any human being who tries to drink salt water is at minimum going to get sick, and they may get severely ill. And it's also easily apparent that they're not always mixing. That people discussed this in ancient times. They discussed how there was a difference, how the two were incapable of being mixed together, as the following quotes kind of illustrate. So first we have from James chapter 3. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. So I'm not suggesting in this particular case that the Bible was an influence on the Quran. It is in places, but in this particular case, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just providing this as an example of people talking about the distinct nature of salt and fresh water and how they are completely different. Well, I mean, of course, they're not really completely different, but that they are of a different nature. That they, a body of salt water cannot produce fresh water. They're separated. From Pliny's Natural History, he writes, in fact, the nature of water is also not deficient in marvels. Patches of fresh water float on the surface of the sea, being doubtless lighter. So Pliny has observed that sometimes fresh water doesn't immediately mix with salt water, and it floats as a result of being lighter, as he says it. There's actually more going on physically than that, but he's proposing a reason why this doesn't occur, which means he's observed that the mixing didn't occur, which means he had the knowledge that bodies of water don't always mix. And then finally, especially striking here from the book of Acts, chapter 27, but striking a wreath, as the translation has, but in the Greek, it's literally striking a place between two seas. Incidentally, pointing out yet another way people could observe that there are conflicting currents, because where the two currents meet each other, the barrier that cannot be transgressed, sediment tends to be deposited, builds up a barrier, a sand barrier, a barrier reef, and then boats get stuck on it, which is what is happening here in the book of Acts. They're talking literally about the meeting place of two seas, just like the Quran does. And then finally, we have to ask, is this a lucky guess? I.e., are there enough possibilities that someone just guessing at complete random couldn't come up with this idea? Well, there's only two possibilities. Either the two types of waters mix or they don't. If we're talking about connected seas and rivers, it might be surprising that a sea and a river don't mix, but it's also a wrong guess. So it might be a surprising guess, but it's wrong. They do mix. If we're talking about types of water, it's not unlikely. Human beings recognized that salt water and fresh water were distinct things. They could easily observe all kinds of distinct things didn't mix with salt water or fresh water, if you prefer. You throw a stick in the ocean, it doesn't mix. So it's not really that unlikely to guess that salt and seawater wouldn't guess. And of course, if it's a physical barrier, like the tafsir suggests, either the land or the sky, well, then, of course, that's quite an obvious guess to make that, oh, yes, they don't mix because there's a giant body of land in between them. So I don't know about you, but I'm not feeling so good about this being a scientific miracle. What do you think?
Well, you set up 5 criteria to test Muslim claim, which they kind of claim that this is the claim of Allah, that there is a barrier between seawater and they do not mix. And with your 5 criteria and putting them together, it seems we need to create more miracles and more miracles to make what Muslims are saying today.
Yeah, in this particular case, I don't think any of the 5 criteria were met.
That's right.
Over 5 on this particular claim.
So no miracle at all.
Yep, that is my conclusion as well. I guess a Muslim can kind of take their pick here. Either the Quran's talking about obvious knowledge, in which case there's no claim of a scientific miracle or foreknowledge, or if we want to go with the claim that they made, it's just a scientific error. So either way, not a miracle.
Okay, so we find out the first one of the scientific errors, which was not a miracle at all. No miracle doesn't mean like there is something in it. It's like no, okay, zero miracles in this mixing the water thing. Even though we don't have selfie evidence, but all the examples and all the information put forward for us clearly shows there is no miracle here.
Yeah, unfortunately, this one didn't stack up, but we got to be fair. We can go to another one, and maybe it will provide some evidence.
There is always hope. Not in Islam, but there is always hope.
Well, there's hope in Islam as long as you're alive, because you can still leave Islam.
Yeah, the hope of Muslims. So that's not hope in Islam. That's the hope for Muslims.
Yes. Yeah. Good clarification there. Hope for Muslims, not hope for the religion of Islam.
Because Islam itself is like destroying itself. Islamic early Muslim commentaries are just kind of trying to figure out what Allah tried to say. Geography kind of shows us actually what Muslims are saying is not what Allah tried to say, and what Muslims are saying has nothing to do with like what's happening in reality. So therefore there was like no miracle. Therefore Islam itself destroys Islam.
Yeah, it's amazing how the tafsir not only disagree with one another at times, they often offer like 3 or 4 different interpretations for the same verse.
Come on, brother. That's not amazing. That's miracle. It is
oh, yes.
That talks you.
It's a miracle. Well, to paraphrase a Muslim claim in a different context, it's a miracle because all of the meanings are simultaneously true. When you have an Arabic word, any meaning you can possibly give it is always true, but only in the Quran. That's the miracle. All right, so shall we take another one?
Yes, please.
Let's look at the so-called miracle of the expanding universe. This is also sometimes claimed that the Quran teaches the Big Bang specifically. I went with the expanding universe, which is a less ambitious claim. Therefore, it should, in theory, be easier for the Muslim to prove. I mean, if they want to claim the whole Big Bang, more power to them. But I find it the verse they go to do that too ridiculous to even think about. And we'll actually get to see that verse in a minute in a unrelated scientific miracle claim, strangely enough. But expanding the universe, that's a less ambitious claim. It's related to the Big Bang, but less ambitious. So we'll go with that one. 5147 from Sahih International. In the heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed we are expander. That word that's translated as expander is going to come into play later, but I do want to give Sahih International some credit here. although I don't think it means expander. At least they translated it as a noun. There are Muslim translations of the Quran that will translate, we are expanding it, which means it's a verb, even though it's actually a noun in Arabic. The claim here from the website Al-Islam: at the time the Holy Quran was revealed, the human understanding of the nature of the cosmos and the movement or the stillness of the heavenly bodies was exceptionally primitive and obscure. The concept of the expanding universe has been universally accepted by the scientific community as fact. This discovery was made by Edwin Hubble in the 1920s. Yet some 13 centuries before this, it was clearly mentioned in the Quran. It should be remembered that the concept of the continuous expansion of the universe is exclusive to the Quran. No other divine scriptures even remotely hint at it. Well, we'll get to see what other texts say about the expansion of the universe in a second. He is correct that the scientific, he's partially correct. The scientific consensus about a steady state universe developed in the scientific revolution in the 1800s. It began to change in the 1920s. It didn't actually become scientific consensus till much more recently. Hubble observed the moving of the bodies apart from each other, which could imply the expansion. But it wasn't until the discovery of cosmic background radiation much later that it became near universal scientific consensus that the universe is expanding. So let's dive into the criterion. We can dispatch these first couple fairly quickly. We'll give them a pass here. So is it true? Yes. There are occasionally scientists who don't hold to the expanding universe model, that they hold to a different model, but they're in the extreme minority. You know, it's like 95% consensus, 98% consensus, something like that the universe is expanding. Was it observable in the 7th century? Well, no, it wasn't directly observable using 7th century technology. That took to the discovery of super powerful telescopes and devices to measure the state of the universe. So off to a good start. It's past our first two criteria. Since Hatun dropped off for a second, I'll just continue on. So, is the expanding universe original to the Quran? Now, this was a crucial part of the Muslim claim. They said that no other divine text has ever made this claim. Well, they might say that they might have put in that phrasing divine text on purpose to get around the fact that other texts that they don't consider divine contain it, but that's just laziness. If it's in another text, it's in another text, whether or not you view it as divine. Or I shouldn't say lazy, I should say deceptive, if that's what they intended. Or maybe they just didn't actually know. Maybe they were just ignorant and didn't know that other texts talk about this. So many ancient cultures speak of, basically every culture has their own creation myth. And a lot of cultures have a creation myth that describes the universe being born out of an egg. This is especially common in the cultures that are derived from Hindu or Zoroastrian beliefs that would have been accessible in the ancient Near East, incidentally. In these stories about the creation of the universe, oftentimes it's described that the egg bursts open and that the universe comes out of it, expanding and growing. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, I could plausibly equate that with a Big Bang. And of course, the Quran isn't going to describe the Big Bang using the terms Big Bang, but it could say something like the universe started as a tiny object and has been expanding ever since, or that it started as a tiny object, exploded, has been expanding ever since. Or it could do something like these other creation myths do and say that the Quran was an egg, which is, the universe, it was an egg, a pretty small object, and then it burst open and it has been expanding since. I think that's, I'm not saying it's a miraculous that these other ancient myths had something that kind of sort of resembles the Big Bang. I'm just saying if the Quran actually taught the Big Bang, that would be something pretty equivalent to it. Welcome back, Katun.
You noticed? Sorry about that.
Hey, no worries.
So universe expands and only Quran knew that?
Yeah, well, that's the Muslim claim that only the Quran knew it. Turns out that there are many cultures who have a creation myth that involves an expanding universe, however. And then if we turn to the Bible, there are a number, and we move back from that more ambitious Big Bang claim to just an expansion claim. There's about a dozen or so verses in the Bible that speak in somewhat similar language to what the Quran says about God spreading out the heavens. In Isaiah 40:22, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads like a tent to dwell in. Now, if I'm going to put my Muslim hat on here, I would say that not only does this teach the expansion of the universe, it also teaches that the earth is a spherical object among that vast universe, and that the universe has spread out over time, and only this tiny object, the earth, is our tent that we get to dwell in. Now, I'm not saying that's what the text actually says, but if I'm putting on my scientific miracle hat here, I would say that this is a better description of the expansion of the universe than what the Quran has. Even more so than the passage from chapter 40 there, though, this verse from chapter 42, the language is extremely similar to the Quran. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it. Now, we haven't yet looked at the verse that follows the one that the Muslims claim is a miracle in the Quran, but when we do, we're going to see that the language in Isaiah 42 about stretching out the heavens and then spreading out the earth is also found in the Quran. I'm not saying that there necessarily was direct influence, but in this case, there is a pretty strong parallel, and no person who was not beholden to Islamic beliefs would come remotely close to saying that the Quran was written before Isaiah. So it's a possibility. It's at least a possibility that this verse directly influenced our scientific miracle in the Quran. And I saw that you also had pulled up from the audience Job 9:8, and there's several other places as well in the Old Testament that speak of spreading out the heavens, which is all the Muslim claim is based on. And, well, at least in theory, when we actually get to look at the tafsir, that might not even be what the Quran is saying. But any thoughts you'd like to add on other texts containing similar ideas? Atun, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, any thoughts you wanted to add about other texts here?
So Christian scripture expresses how God, out of his kindness, creates everything. Mm-hmm. And then he tries to communicate that with his people. And no one goes around and then say, oh, because of this verse, this confirms what the science is going to say within coming 2,000 years. we read them as, see how amazing our God is, how he communicates with us, versus Mr. Muslim read the passage and then they just like, wow, there would be nobody who ever talked about this. This is a scientific claim Allah is making. And it is being kind of confirmed to be true in 21st century. Therefore, it is from Allah. Just like such a different way of thinking.
Yeah, I would have more respect for the Muslim if they just approached the text and they claimed that it was beautiful and a literary masterpiece. I mean, I don't think it is, but I would at least have more respect for that claim than these ridiculous attempts to read the text in a way that the author never intended in a desperate attempt to prove that it's somehow true.
It's just such a shame, like you are trying to force things into the text and making text, producing miracle from that text by coming up lots of different ideas. But all you are doing is just trying to tell us, well, word of Allah just doesn't make sense. Therefore, I have to have my input in this. And that's just wrong way of treating the word of Allah, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Muslims sometimes claim that we're more Christian than the Christians. Well, I wouldn't say I'm more Muslim than a Muslim, but I would say that in many cases I respect your text more than you do, because I try to treat what it says seriously. I try to actually understand what the text says instead of just going to it and trying to find my idea in the text. I try to determine what it actually says, which is how you actually respect a text. So now we have to ask the question, does the Quran teach this? And I saw someone in the chat kind of saying that the word of the Quran has been mistranslated, and I think that's what we're going to see from these tafsir as well. If we look at translations before the Hubble discovery into English, they don't talk about expanding universe. For example, in Yusuf Ali's translation, made around the turn of the century, with power and skill did we construct the firmament, for it is we who create the vastness of space. This word that is probably properly translated as vastness has somehow become expand. Expander in Sahih International, or even expanding in other translations. The next verse after the one we looked at, verse 48, has parallel grammar. So whatever we conclude about what it is telling us, we should probably conclude the same thing about the verse 47, the one that supposedly has the miracle. And we have spread out the earth. How excellently do we spread out? Remember, Isaiah said we spread out the heavens. We establish, you guys are like grasshoppers in comparison. We spread out the earth as a dwelling place for you. Well, the Quran then says we spread out the earth. But we have a problem. We don't have a problem if it's describing God creating the heavens and the earth, but we have a problem if we go for what the Muslim wants it to be, that it's teaching the continual expansion of the universe. That would mean that the earth is continually expanding as well, which is obviously not true. So they have to read these two verses, which contain the same language, are parallel to one another, conveying a continuous thought, and they have to read it in two different ways from one verse to the next. And the tafsir, not surprisingly, didn't make this modern, this verse means something different than this verse. They saw them as closely related. Ibn Kathir says that he talks about the vast space with a roof above it, talking about not spreading, but how vast not expansion, but how vast the space is. Al-Tabari talks about a strong roof and a wide space. And Al-Qurtubi says that the verse speaks of the ability of God, consistent with a Christian interpretation of Isaiah. And then he says it's either talking about the space between man and God, i.e. how far away we are from God. He's giving it kind of a more poetic meaning. Or it's talking about the abundance of life, which has, in his words, been expanded by rain. And we'll see why he got that interpretation into this verse, even though it's not there, when we look at the next miracle claim. And then finally he says it could just be purely metaphorical and it's just about the enrichment of humanity. Kurtubi, unlike the other tafsirs, tends to offer these metaphysical, metaphorical interpretations as a possibility. None of them, though, say anything about an expanding universe.
Have you noticed how Kurtubi proposes 4 different interpretation just for one verse? It might be this,
Yes.
or this, or this, or this. Pick whichever you want. It's such a shame because remember, claim Quran makes it is well detailed, well explained. Yet
Exactly.
commentaries comes in and then tries to unpack for that well detailed, well explained Quran, and they try to explain to us verse, and then they give us like 4 versions. It might be this, or this, or this, or this. No one knows what Allah meant.
Yeah, and I don't know about this particular passage, but sometimes he'll even after giving the different interpretations, sometimes he'll even say after that, and only Allah knows which one is correct.
Yeah. Such a shame.
So then our final criteria that we're using to evaluate these is we have to ask, is it a lucky guess? Are there so few possibilities that even if someone had no way to observe it, no knowledge whatsoever, and they're just guessing at random, could they come to this conclusion? Well, there are essentially 3 possible explanations or states of the universe. It could be expanding, it could be contracting, or it could be staying the same. And while the 19th century man in the phase of the scientific revolution did come to this steady state conclusion, that's not necessarily the same conclusion that ancient people came to. Just because some modern scientists who were looking at the universe and expecting it to be constant and thus guessed that the universe was all constant because the physical laws are constant, doesn't mean that ancient people thought of that way. And the egg analogy from the ancient creation myths, the growth of life in general, even without the egg analogy, just people look, human beings start really small and then they get bigger. Trees start as a tiny seed and then they get bigger. Every living creature seems to start small and then get bigger. It wouldn't be that unlikely for someone to say, maybe the universe is the same. Maybe it started small and got bigger. Because especially if you're thinking of it as a life form or pseudo life form, that as these creation myths cast it in. So does it go beyond a lucky guess? I would say no there as well. So we looked at 5 criteria to evaluate this claim of whether the Quran has a scientific miracle of the expanding universe. What is your conclusion on this one, Hatun?
I think this is one of the scientific miracles, just made me so confident that Islam is truth.
Somehow I'm guessing that is sarcastic.
Yes, that's a miracle by itself. Through this
So
I have been miracled by making a miracle claim that I am about to say my shahada.
yeah, that would definitely be a miracle if you are convinced by this passage to convert to Islam, because I don't see any other explanation as to why someone would be convinced, at least after looking at the evidence. Maybe if they just...
It keeps 1.6 or 8 million people in Islam. Kurtubi, Ibn Kathir, and Tabari, it seems like they were all just like, wow, we've got lots of options for this one. And the word of Allah is not very clear at all. They're all miracle for me, so I think I can take this.
All right. Yeah. The miracle of reinterpretation. All those early Muslims who Muhammad said were the best Muslims and that any Muslims who came after him would be worse Muslims, they had no clue what the Quran was talking about. They had no knowledge of the Quran. It's only modern Muslims who have the benefit of knowing what Western non-Muslim scientists have concluded about the universe who can correctly read the Quran. So my conclusion is, in fact, that there's no scientific miracle or miracle of any kind. At least the science was correct. We don't even always see that. We didn't see that in the first case. We only saw scientific error in the first case. But there's no reason to believe that's what the text is teaching. And even if that is what the text was teaching, similar ideas are found in the Bible and other texts as well. So no miracle, unfortunately. This is just the Muslim offering a creative interpretation that, even if their interpretation was correct, would not demonstrate any advanced knowledge.
So keep away from Islam, huh?
Yep, so 0 for 2, but, let's press on. There's more claims that the Muslims make. These aren't the only two. Maybe, if we look enough, we'll find something that holds up to scrutiny.
Yeah, and other thing is it's not you went and picked those verses. It is Muslims brought up those verses, and we are just looking at them, checking what the verse itself say, what early Muslims said, and it has anyway. This can be scientific miracle. So we are just dealing with what Mr. or Mrs. Muslims provided you.
Exactly. I would, if a Muslim wasn't trying to claim that there was some advanced scientific knowledge in this verse, I would have no problem with it. And, if the verse is just describing that God created the universe and this demonstrates his power, I'd say amen to that. But then they try to go beyond what the verse says to make it say something else, and that is what I have a problem with. So let's take a look at another one. We saw in Qurtubi that he spoke of the rainwater bringing about life, which will be very relevant here in a second. Let's turn to 21:30. Have those who disbelieved not considered that the heavens and earth were a joined entity, and we separated them and made from water every living thing? Then will they not believe? So, as is the case for many of these perfectly clear scientific miracles in the Quran, you go to two different Muslims, they'll both say there's a scientific miracle, but they'll disagree about what it is. Occasionally you'll find a Muslim who goes to this verse and say, this verse is teaching evolution. This is proof that the Quran knew the theory of evolution. Well, most Muslims don't believe in evolution, so most Muslims won't want to go there. But it does happen from time to time. They'll look at the first half of this verse and they'll say that's the Big Bang. Yeah, it's not, but we're going to focus on the second half of this verse, which says we separated them and made from water every living thing. Here is the claim from the Muslim Vibe. More than half your body is water. Animals and plants on Earth are mostly water. All life in our universe also needs water. When scientists search for life on exoplanets, they only look for planets with water. No water means no life. However, Muslims knew about this 1,400 years before it was discovered. In the Quran, all life on earth and in heaven depends on water. How can an illiterate man who lived 1,400 years ago have known that all life in the universe also needs water? So before getting into the criteria, what are your first thoughts here, Hatun? Do you think that ancient people didn't know that water was essential for life?
No, I don't think they did not. They did know that. Probably they didn't know if they don't drink water for 3 days, they will be getting process of dying. They didn't know. They didn't know. They wouldn't know.
Well, especially the illiterate, because they didn't read in a book that they needed to drink water. They just didn't know.
Yeah. And probably because they couldn't read, as you said, they couldn't find, probably they didn't read it from the book. And when they saw people were drinking water, they were just silly people. It's just Waste of time, waste of water.
Yep. I'm guessing that's probably what the case is, but I guess we should probably go ahead and not just assume the Muslim's correct and go ahead and look at the evidence.
Think
So
about
our
it.
first,
Think about it. In like, let's say in Saudi Arabia part of the world, there is no like, it's difficult to go and get water in 7th century. Probably when they were like traveling with their camels, when the camels needs water, probably they just like, oh no, that's just imaginary. They can go from one side of the desert to other side of the desert without water. Even we can go without water. If we really, really desperately need of water, all we need to do is drink the camel urine. But for you to do that, you still need water. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think like they understood that. I'm just thinking loud right now. Like, I'm trying to imagine in 7th century hot, because people, there is a hadith that people are dying when they put hot iron in their eyes, like they let them to die from thirst. So I think that already tells me they didn't know water was very important for life.
indeed, yeah. But, let's not just assume. Let's go ahead and be responsible, look at the evidence. But I agree on the surface. This seems like something that no person would know. It wasn't in the
sorry, I'm gonna forget this now. So this is the verse Muslims brought it
yes.
to you to make a claim. Actually, those are also Zakir Naik's book as well. Muslims brought it to you to make a claim. These are the scientific miracles, and then they even put on their website.
Correct. Yes, this is under an article called "The Miracles of the Quran: Water" on a Muslim website called The Muslim Vibe. That's where I quoted here. Seen it other places. Interestingly enough, in a video that I did a direct response to, part of their claim is that a desert person especially wouldn't expect things to be made of water. When I would tend to think it's probably the opposite, that a person in the desert would be more appreciative of the value of water, but what do I know?
Probably when they sweat, they was just like, we can just lick this our sweats. We don't need water. Yeah, that was disgusting. Anyway, let's continue.
So moving into the criteria. So with these, we always have to first ask, is the scientific claim even true? Because it's not always the case that these claims of scientific miracles are true. In this case, I will say yes. It is true that all living creatures are largely composed of water. Not really identical to being made of water, but close enough. I'll say that if the Quran was claiming that all creatures are made of water, that would be scientifically true, or close enough, and in common speaking, even if it's not scientifically precise. There are people who speculate that water isn't necessarily essential to life, but that's unproven. So that's just speculation. And some people say maybe there is a way for a life form to live without water, but there's no actual concrete examples of that. That's just theoretical. So we'll say yes, it's true. And was it observable? Well, yes, it was observable. So our criteria is this something that an ordinary person could observe in the 7th century? And if they can, then it doesn't require any divine knowledge to know that. 7th century people were aware that animals and plants would die without water, as we've kind of already humorously alluded to. And we need to keep in mind that water to an ancient person is synonymous with liquid. They're not necessarily talking about hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. They're talking about liquid, really, when they say water. And in that sense, it's readily apparent that animals and plants have water or liquid inside them. You cut a human, you cut any other animal, they bleed. They bleed liquid. You cut a plant open, you can see water inside it. Indeed, people in the desert know The people in the desert know that when they're desperate for water, they can cut open a plant and extract some water from it. Did you want to say something?
Yes, can I just distract and ask a practical question?
Mm-hmm.
You think that, since you are talking about liquid, do you think that Muhammad knew that ice was the form of water?
Probably not. I would guess that he probably did not observe ice, so he probably didn't really know what it was. But a human being who is in a cool enough climate to allow for ice would probably be able to figure that out pretty easily by observing ice melting.
Okay. Thank you.
So the article, and they always do this, is they'll point out that there are many creatures that Muhammad couldn't have known existed, very tiny creatures that you can only see with a microscope. And they're made of water too. Bacteria are made of water. Everything's made of water, all living things. And that's true, but it's completely irrelevant because the Quran doesn't suggest that there are microscopic creatures. If it doesn't make a claim about microscopic creatures being about water, the fact that they're composed of water is irrelevant. The Quran could make that claim. It could very easily say there are living creatures that are too small for your eyes to see. If it made that claim, that would, I wouldn't call it miraculous, but it would at least be foreknowledge. It would be, I would say that it's easily guessed that they're smaller creatures, but it would at least be something. Instead, they have to go to verses like this that say that all living creatures are made of water and try to make it about microscopic creatures, since the Quran didn't bother to tell us about these microscopic creatures, that they're, despite the claim that we looked at the start where the Muslims said that these scientific miracles are in the Quran because Allah knew that atheist scientists would come along, so he put science in there to disprove their scientific claims. No, he could have put in a claim about tiny microscopic creatures. He didn't, strangely enough. Oops, meant to go forward. So then the third criteria we always ask is this an idea that's new to the Quran? If a human being had this idea before the time of the Quran, then it's obviously an idea that human beings could come up with. We need not assert direct dependence, although the Quran may be dependent on previous texts. It need not be the case. If someone else says it, that proves that human beings can come up with the idea of their own, and it doesn't require a divine source. And the answer to this question is no, this is definitely not unique knowledge of the Quran that animals are composed of water. Greek philosophy from very ancient times, the first millennia BC, had decided that everything, and I mean living things, non-living things, rocks, everything, is composed of only 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So there's only 4 basic elements, and everything is composed of one or more of those 4 things. This idea isn't unique to Greek philosophy. Other cultures who probably did not have direct contact with ancient Greece share similar ideas, which would suggest that these ideas are very, very ancient, and that they probably predate the establishment of writing even. So definitely not new, the idea that things could be composed of water. And I would suggest that the Quran also believes in 4-element theory. You can see this alluded to in several places, but I like to go to the example of Surah 55, verses 14 and 15. He created man from sounding clay like onto pottery, and he created jinns from fire free of smoke. Now, if you're not used to 4-element theory language, you wouldn't necessarily see what's going on here. But clay is the normal term used to describe the combination of earth and water. So when you have earth combined with water, it's called clay in 4-element literature. So 2 elements present there. And then he says that the author says that he, meaning Allah, created the jinn from fire, free of smoke. Smoke is used synonymously with air in 4-element theory. And this particular phrase, fire free of smoke, is the usual way of describing pure fire. that it's the fire element mixed with nothing else. So, in fact, all four of the elements are contained in this one verse, and it's talking about things that are how things are composed. So human beings are created from two elements. They're created from earth and water. Jinn are created from fire. It seems to me that it's pretty plausible that the author of this text believed in four-element theory. But even if that's not the case, we go to Thales of Miletus, who suggests that water is the fundamental element. So one of the things that the ancient Greeks tried to do is, it's established fact. Obviously, it's not really a fact. It's not actually true, but it's established fact in Greek philosophy that there are four elements. And they tried to establish what's the relationship between the four elements. And there was disagreement. Some said that earth was the fundamental element and other elements were formed from it. Thales says that water is the fundamental element. So if everything is composed of water, well, that includes all living things. And Anaximander even goes further as far as paralleling the Quran goes, writing about the same time as Thales, so 600 BC, somewhere thereabouts, 1300 years before the Quran. He writes that living creatures arose from the moist element as it was evaporated from the sun. So his theory is that somehow the power of the sun acting on water caused life to spontaneously arise. Obviously, it's not correct, but the point being that living creatures are literally being made out of the water. And elsewhere, he says that explicitly, the first living creatures were produced in the moist element. So we have an author 1300 years before the Quran saying that all living creatures are composed of water, using very similar language. But then we have to go back and ask, does the Quran even teach this to begin with? Is this just an idea that a modern Muslim has invented? Is this something that they've imagined in the text? Or is it something that the Quran is actually intending to teach? And the way we've been doing that is we're looking at the classical tafsir written in ancient times, long before the scientific miracle claims took off and people could imagine stuff in the text. And although it kind of seems like the verse does say that, oddly enough, the tafsirs don't agree. They say that's probably not the case. So remember that first half of verse 21:30, where it's talking about the separation of the heavens and the earth. Well, unlike the modern Muslim, the commentators don't see these as separate thoughts. They see that whatever that is saying and whatever it's saying about creatures being composed of water or made of water is related, that they're part of the same thing. So Ibn Kathir suggests that the heaven and the earth were originally joined together, and that when they were split apart, the sky was created and it was the rain that brought forth life. Remember, Kurtubi smuggled that interpretation of rain bringing forth life into the verse on God spreading out the universe. No doubt he was thinking of 21:30 when he smuggled that interpretation into that verse. Al-Tabari offers various opinions on what that first half means, the separation of the heaven and the earth, and a lot of the tafsirs are very confused as to what that means. But on the second half, the part that we're looking at as the miracle claim, all of the interpretations that he offers, they all agree that rain is what the second half of the verse is referring to. Similarly, Kurtubi says that has numerous opinions reported on the first half of the verse, and then he offers just a couple on the second half. He says that it could mean rain, like the other commentators, or that it means that water is necessary to survival, which is kind of how we were talking about the verse earlier, that people would know that water is necessary to survive. So he probably just observed that and thought maybe that's what the verse meant. Or he says that everything is made from solid water, which I put as ice here. I think he actually literally says solid water, or that it's made from normal liquid water. So he does offer the everything made from water. So one of his 5 different interpretations is what the modern Muslim claims. They get, 1 out of 7 chance here. If we look at Kefir, Talbari, and Kirby combined, say maybe 1 out of 7 chance that's what the verse actually refers to. So slight pass on this, but probably not. It probably means rainwater according to these ancient commentaries. Finally, we ask the question, is this a lucky guess? Is this something that someone who couldn't observe it, didn't have any actual knowledge, is it something that they could reasonably guess because there's not a lot of different options to begin with? And I guess this one's a little hard to say for sure because it depends. If we decide that the author of the Quran believed in 4-element theory, well, then he's kind of limited to 4 elements or some combination thereof. So not a huge number of things. But I suppose in theory you could find some random idiot who just says any random thing, that all living life is composed of sunshine. All living life is composed of stones. So let's just be generous and say there's a lot of choices that someone could pick at random. So yes, it's a bit more than a lucky guess in this case.
Or you can say it's a miracle. This is a miracle.
Well, it does pass our miracle test on the 5th criteria, but it needs to pass all of the 5, not just the 1.
I know we are asking for 5, it to pass 5 criteria, but I think since the examples they bring forward, we saw none of them passed. We need to start practicing generosity. So even if passed, even one of them passed half of the criteria of 1, or even half of the quarter, then we should let that pass as a miracle. Otherwise,
Okay.
like seriously, no miracle.
Yeah, well, I'll take your advice. I'll be very generous today and say that if one of the things we look at covers 4 of the 5 criteria, we can say that that is almost a miracle. However, I believe we only passed 2 of the 5 criteria, so not even 50%. I mean, you got to at least get over 50% if you want me to give it some credit.
Andrew Martin earlier stated, I forgot, still it's on the screen, he blinded me with science.
Well, I think that I think that the Muslim eyes have definitely been blinded. So he might be onto something there.
Yeah.
So my conclusion, I know you want me to be generous here, but my conclusion is just going to be that there's no miracle in this particular passage.
That's a generous. That's very generous to say no miracles.
Yes, because it's actually good point. I could say that there's blatant scientific error in this passage.
Yeah.
Because there is. So just saying no miracle, that is being generous. You're right.
Yep.
So
far we looked at 3 examples, and then what we saw is the examples which Muslims brought forth regarding the verses confirm the scientific miracles of the Quran. All of them failed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just wanted to make sure I
understood. We're 0 for 3 so far, and just to sum up the water, or all things being made from water, we give them a pass in the science. The language is a little imprecise, but I think it's close enough that we can give them a pass there. But unfortunately for the Muslim, it's also easily observable by any human being at any time period. It was well-known information at the time of the Quran, and their attempt to bring in microscopic creatures is totally irrelevant because the Quran doesn't know they exist, so it can't be evidence of some kind of miraculous knowledge since it doesn't talk about them. We have one more example for today, which is the miracle of the iron being sent down. This one, it's a little hard to put them in order of popularity, but I'd say there's a good chance this is in the top 2 most popular miracle claims. From Surah 57, verse 25, reading from the Sahih International Translation, "We have already sent down our messengers with clear evidences and sent down with them the scriptures and the balance that the people may maintain in justice. And we sent down iron, wherein a great military might and benefits for the people, and so that Allah may make evident those who support him and his messengers unseen." So now we'll go to the Muslim claim. I want to be fair. I want to look at what the Muslim actually claims, not just, make a straw man argument where I'm pretending this is what they claim. I'm going to read their actual words and analyze the actual words of their claim. So the word anzalna, translated as sent down, and used for iron in that verse, could be thought of as having a metaphorical meaning to explain that iron has been given to benefit people. Yeah, maybe you should have just stopped there. Just side note. But when we take into consideration the literal meaning of the word, which is being physically sent down from the sky, as this word usage has not been employed in the Quran except literally, like the descending of the rain or revelation, we realize that this verse implies a very significant scientific miracle, because modern astronomical findings have disclosed that the iron found in our world has come from giant stars in outer space. So, hopefully I didn't give it away too much, where this is going to go. But what are your first thoughts on this passage, Tim?
It looks like a scary movie. A miracle.
A miracle indeed.
Yeah, it's just that. What is the word you would use to say one of the best miracle or something? But it needs to be like different word than best. One of the most
grandiose, fantastic.
Okay, yeah, one of the most fantastic miracle, like a scary movie. Why did you hide this to the last one? No, I'm not able to sleep because it's all like very scary movie to me.
Yeah, you got these people. It looks like they're on a vague outline of people here. It looks like they are on a beach and they're seeing the iron come down, and it looks like it's the end of the world or something.
Yeah. What a shame.
So let's go ahead and take the Muslim claim seriously and analyze it. The first criteria we ask is this true? It should be a given, but unfortunately, often Muslims will make a claim that there's a scientific miracle in the Quran, and then they'll say something which isn't even scientifically true, even though that's the part that should just be a given for them, because since they know what the answer is, should get that part right every time. But in this case, the best I can do is say sort of. That the Muslim said that the iron found in our world has come from giant stars in outer space. Well, what he's alluding to is that heavy elements, in fact, all elements heavier than helium, are only created in the supernova of stars. When a star reaches the end of its life, it collapses, explodes. It's a supernova, and this is what produces the heavy elements in the earth, according to the scientific consensus. So it's technically true that it came from giant stars, but the language he's used is really kind of hiding what actually goes on, because that doesn't sound anything like being sent down. Because every single heavy element on Earth, carbon, that all life is composed of, silicon, gold, everything, every heavy element is composed or is formed in the supernova. So if that's what the verse means, then why did it signal out iron? However, a small amount of iron and all the other heavy metals lands on Earth from meteorites. So that is a more close resemblance to being sent down, but the vast majority of iron on Earth did not come from meteors. Maybe like 1% or something comes from meteors. The rest has been on Earth since it was formed, according to the scientific consensus. So, was it observable? Could a 7th century person using 7th century technology, i.e. primarily using their eyes and their ability to think for themselves, observe this? Well, in principle, yes. And someone could watch a meteorite hit, they could find the debris, and then they could notice that iron is included in the debris of the meteorite. Now, to my mind, at first glance, that doesn't seem all that likely that someone would observe that. But in fact, that is what must have happened, because a whole bunch of ancient cultures have this belief of iron coming from outer space. The ancient Egyptians, for example, long before the time of Muhammad, the ancient Egyptian society fell in the 1st century AD, so definitely before the time of Muhammad, they concluded that iron came from space. Quoting an article by an Egyptologist here, to the ancient Egyptians, iron was known as the metal of heaven. In the hieroglyph language of ancient Egyptians, it was pronounced ba and pet, meaning either stone or metal from heaven. So the very word for iron in Egyptian comes from heaven. So either stone comes from heaven or metal that comes from heaven. So apparently people did observe this, which then obviously answers the question about was this original to the Quran. I already alluded to the Egyptians having this idea that iron was metal from heaven. And actually, if you dig into their theology, they believed that iron was the actual substance of what heaven was made of. They thought that outer space, as we now know it, was composed of the metal iron. And so they thought it was the very nature of things from heaven that they're composed of iron. In Egyptian to Egypt, many other cultures also had the same sort of belief, presumably also from observing meteorites. Now, to be clear, they wouldn't actually have to necessarily observe the meteorite falling. They could just find a fallen meteorite, recognize what that was, and find iron there. In Tibetan, there's a word which is togcha, which means sky iron. Iron from meteorites was highly prized throughout the region. That rich people in the region took iron and they made jewelry out of it. They used it as a form of currency. And the reason that iron was so valuable in the ancient world, especially iron from meteorites, is that iron is, unlike other metals, is very difficult to harvest from the earth, to separate it from the rock, or smelting, to use the correct term, because it requires very immense heat to melt iron, much higher temperatures than other types of metal. But as a result, it's also much stronger. So it's very useful, but it's also very hard to get, making it very valuable, and that's why it was a prized possession. Plutarch calls iron, along with lodestone, the bone of the gods. So he thought that the literal physical bones of the literal physical gods that the ancients believed in was composed of iron. So again, an indication that it's the thing of heaven. There's multiple Hittite texts that speak of iron of heaven or iron from heaven, and Sumerian texts also refer to iron coming from heaven. Now, all of these texts are from the BC era, with the exception of Plutarch, which still predates the Quran. So, known from at least 1 to 2 millennia before the time of Muhammad that iron comes from heaven, or at least sometimes comes from heaven. But does the Quran teach it? Is this just an invention of modern Muslims creatively reading their text, or is this something that all Muslims have believed when they read the perfectly clear Quran, that this is the only interpretation that they could come to from the text? Well, this is why I had to hold back laughter as I was reading the Muslim claim, because remember he said that the term anzalna is only used for physical sending down in the Quran. In fact, it's used more than 100 times in the Quran, saying Allah sent down various things, including the very verse which the iron comes from. In the case of this verse, it says that the messengers of God were sent down from heaven and that the scripture or book was sent down from heaven. Doesn't seem too plausible that Muhammad literally was sent from space. Maybe he had some spaceship, he was an alien or something, I don't know. I don't think that's what the text is saying, but the Muslim claimed that this term can only mean, or almost all, exclusive in the Quran at least, it exclusively means physical descent from heaven, which means also that clothing physically descends from heaven, food physically descends from heaven, people of the book physically descended from heaven, and yes, cows physically descended from heaven. Now, I don't believe that cows came from heaven, but maybe the science just has not caught up here. Maybe soon scientists will discover that cattle actually originated on a foreign planet and they took a spaceship to come to Earth and thus were sent down from heaven to Earth. Yeah. If that's where the Muslim wants to go, then I'm happy to let them go there, but otherwise stop claiming that this term has any kind of special meaning. Let's look at what the ancient tafsir say about the verse. Ibn Kathir says it refers specifically to Muhammad. He claims that this verse is not about Allah's blessings in general, but it's about Muhammad. He says that this verse is about Allah sending Muhammad iron so that he could raise an army of people after the people of Mecca didn't listen to him, i.e., he was ordered to take up iron weapons and kill the disbelievers. It's very interesting how these ancient commentators see violent commands everywhere in the Quran, even when they're not there on the surface. Al-Tabri's a little bit less explicit. He doesn't say it's about Muhammad, but he does say it's about prophets, and he does say it's about prophets physically fighting unbelievers with the benefit of iron weapons. Qurtubi, as per his usual style, offers various different explanations. He says that it might be one of the four blessings of God, the other being fire, water, and salt. He says that it might refer to Adam physically carrying iron tools with him when he came from paradise as the first human being, which is, of course, absurd because iron tools were not invented until much later in human history. Or he might be saying that God created iron. Well, if that's all he's saying, then if that's all the verse says, I'm fine with that. I mean, God did create iron, but it's also hardly a miraculous statement to say that God created iron when he created everything else as well.
Just, can I make a quick point on that? If we go with the Qurtubi's interpretation that Adam physically took the irons from paradise because it was tool, that means they're identifying Adam as the first thief. He stole things which were belonging to paradise and then he brought them to this world.
I guess you're right. I hadn't considered that, but
Not sure how wise it is for Muslims to call one of their prophet thief. I know Muhammad stole underwear stuff, but like this is like stealing from paradise. And no one kind of just like stopped it. No one noticed it until Qurtubi put it down and everyone was okay with that thief. Because none of the context kind of applies it was a gift or anything.
Correct. Yeah, maybe there was too many demons trying to sneak into heaven that day when Adam was being sent to earth. So Allah was too busy throwing stars at the demons to notice that Adam had stolen the tools.
He was able to get away.
Yep.
So, first man is a thief from heaven, according to Muslims. Anyway, okay, thank you.
But of course, all the prophets are infallible. They can't do any sin. So, I don't know. Maybe Qurtubi's just wrong.
Okay.
Finally, we have to ask, was this a lucky guess? Is this something that someone with no knowledge, no ability to observe, they could just make as a lucky guess because there's so few possible choices. So this one's a little hard to evaluate because we have to say, what are the choices? Earth, space, and paradise, perhaps, as the possible origins of something. If we're just using the Muslim claim from the introduction that it came from space because iron was formed in a star supernova, well, then the only other possibilities is that it was always on Earth, or maybe that it was in paradise, which is a interesting interpretation, as you point out, that it was stolen from paradise. What about if we say that it was? It means that the less ambitious interpretation occurred to be that it just means that Allah created iron. Well, what's the other possibility? That was created by man, created by animals? I don't know. So seems pretty odd that it always existed, I suppose. So there's a few possibilities here, but how likely would it be to guess that it came from space or Allah, depending on how you're interpreting that? Well, as I said, iron is very rare, or at least relatively rare in the ancient world, since it was hard to get out of the earth, and it's very useful. Iron weapons are vastly superior to weapons made out of other metals that would be available at the time. So, if something's rare and valuable, I don't think it's really that odd to guess that it's a gift from God. So I'm saying it's probably not anything that would go beyond a lucky guess. It kind of seems like the thing someone would guess. Before I reveal my conclusion, do you think that the iron being sent down is one of those miracles of scientific miracles of the Quran, that it's advanced knowledge that no one could have known?
Yes, I do. I got convinced by your presentation, and I come to the miracle conclusion that yes, iron came down from space.
Excellent. I assume that you also now believe that cattle came from outer space.
Yeah.
And that Muhammad was really an alien who came in his spaceship because the messenger was sent down as well.
Yeah. Well, we are talking about like around 7th century. When you look at one of the biographies of Muhammad, it is talking about like how his mom had a fire coming up stuff. So that's like sign of spaceship in 7th century.
I think I could go with that. Or maybe they opened, used even more advanced technology than we can imagine, and they opened a rift in the space-time continuum and just kind of pushed him through that rift, and it just happened to be the rift was right on the top of his mother's private parts, and thus a great light shone forth as Muhammad was being born.
Yeah, therefore I said I'm convinced by those miracles. I would like to bring up a question to you. It was asked earlier by Frank. When we I can't remember if it was you or me, we made a claim that prophets are sinless.
Yes.
So question was where that come from? Do you want to make a comment on that, or do you want?
Yeah, so it's really a bizarre claim that Islam makes. It is a claim they make. This is despite the fact that it contradicts what the Quran states. It explicitly commands Muhammad, who's supposedly the last and greatest of the prophets, to repent of his sin. In Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Muhammad talks about how he needed to repent numerous times a day. I think in one narration it says 60 times a day, and another narration it says 100 times a day. Might not be the precise number, but large numbers. So Muhammad was constantly repenting of the sins he never had. Seems likely to me that early Muslims didn't have this belief about prophets being sinless. But I think what happened probably is that once Muslims started to engage with Christians were saying, why should we follow Muhammad? We follow Jesus. Jesus was sinless. And the Quran actually agrees on that. It agrees that Jesus is sinless. It's the only person it describes as sinless. And then they're like, well, crap, our guy's not very good in comparison. Yeah, he was sinless too. Yeah, that's it. I think that's probably how it came to be. I think that probably the earliest Muslims didn't believe that, and then they're forced into that because Christians could point to Jesus, who actually is sinless.
Yeah, so in Islam, Jesus and his mother is identified as Satan didn't touch them, so they are sinless. Idea of prophets are sinless simply entered the world by Muslim claims. Yeah, Muslims claim that prophets are sinless. Like apparently, according to Muslims, chopping off people's head, putting hot iron, raping, forcing himself to people, buying and selling people, beating people, lying and deceiving. Those things are not sin in Islam. Muhammad did all of those things, and they still identified Muhammad as sinless, even though Quran, Allah asks Muhammad, Allah tells Muhammad, ask forgiveness for your past sins and your future sins. Still, Muslim thinks prophets are sinless. Such a shame, such a shame.
Yeah, it's it's just one of the many miracles of Allah, I guess, that a man who seems to be worse than 99.99% of all human beings to ever live is in fact sinless.
Yeah. That's a miracle.
And yeah, there are many miracles of Islam, just not the ones that they claim. So, conclusion back to the iron being sent down from heaven. Yeah, the conclusion is there's no real miracle here. The scientific claim of the Muslim was deceptive at best. They purposely chose their words to say something which they could say was technically true, but didn't remotely resemble the actual scientific claim about the origins of iron. The fact that iron sometimes arrives on Earth via meteorites is plausibly observable by any person in Muhammad's time. And regardless of how difficult it would be for any given individual to observe, it was known information. Numerous texts from many different cultures across the ancient Near East and beyond speak of iron coming from heaven. And additionally, besides all that, there's no reason to really believe that's what the Quran is claiming to begin with. The tafsir mostly seem to think that it's talking about iron weapons, or they make claims that are obviously false, or they just make such a general claim that it would be true regardless of what was in the verse that God created it. So that is it for me.
That's the end of the miracles?
Well, there are more claims, but I didn't want to make the presentation too long. I do have a separate presentation on specifically the claim of embryology. This is kind of like the granddaddy of all scientific miracles in the Quran. It's where it started. Muslims, that's one of the few texts that they'll actually try to defend to non-Muslims. They'll say that Allah has this miraculous knowledge of the formation of human beings in the womb. So I went into too much detail on that one to be part of a reasonable length presentation, so it stands on its own. I have heard various other claims that I didn't happen to address here.
Would you be okay to have another session to just look at the embryology? We did a couple of live streams in the past, but it's always good to repeat or even bring new things. So because not sadly actually, miracle is those claims still come to Christians on the streets or even to non-Christians where Muslims are making such a claim. So it's good to kind of refresh our minds on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to do a presentation on the embryology. I would also be willing to take off-the-cuff questions if anyone wants to know about a different specific miracle claim. I probably won't have ancient texts I can point to off the top of my head, but I certainly can, talk about what the verse probably actually means as opposed to the Muslim claim. And I mean, a lot of them, all you have to do is read the verse and the miracle turns into a scientific error. You read what it actually says, and it's claiming the exact opposite of what the Muslim says it claims.
So Quranic miracle is Quran has scientific errors.
Yep. I think that's the true miracle here, is that, the plain meaning of the perfectly clear words is a scientific error. But if you have enough ingenuity and enough creativity, you can stretch the words and turn them around and make it into something which is scientifically accurate and claim that Allah had this amazing knowledge. And it's only because of our, hard hearts that we don't see it. Unfortunately, neither did any of the ancient Muslim commentators. So apparently there were no Muslims with pure hearts until today.
Yeah, miracle. That's just miracle by itself. Okay. We can stop here. Thank you very much for sharing all those miracles with us. And in case anyone missed it, so we looked at 4 examples which Muslim brings forth regarding Islamist truth. Here is there some verses. They contain scientific miracles which Muhammad wouldn't know in 7th century. And then we went through 4 of them, and we come to conclusion that miracle was they were all scientific errors.
Yep. And I think that, obviously there is many different attempts at claims, as there are Muslim apologists who can use their creativity to imagine something. But I think if you look at any of these claims, I think basically 100% of the time you'll find that the tafsir didn't know about this perfectly obvious meaning of the Quran. Probably 40% of the time it's not even scientifically accurate, and 100% of the time it's something that was easily observable and ancient people knew about it.
Yeah, that's miracle by itself. Great. Thank you very much for joining me, brother, and thank you very much for helping us to go through some of the examples. And I think above all, it just helps us to see more and more how Islam has not much ground to stand, and claims Muslim missionaries making easily can be destroyed or easily can debunk. All you need to do is just listen to the claim, observe what Allah tried to say, look at the earliest writings, and then use the brain God given to you. And I am confident that you will be able to debunk that claim easily. What are your conclusion remarks, brother?
Yeah,
also, can you just share a little bit with us how we can pray for you, where people can find you beside ihatehatun.com, where people can go and find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, my concluding thoughts. My advice to Christians who want to reach Muslims is to engage Muslims on their claims. I know that the claims often are so ridiculous, it doesn't seem like it's even worth discussing. I mean, I kind of tried to pull out some of the better claims. Some of them, it's even worse than what we looked at here. But I would encourage people to engage Muslims on their own terms, to go to them. I would encourage Christians to offer counterclaims, but I would also encourage them to engage these claims. So, someone says that the Quran contains scientific miracles. My first question would be, what's the best example? And are you willing to discuss it and see if it really stands up to scrutiny? Because if this is actually evidence, it should stand up to scrutiny. And if it's not actually evidence, then you need to find some evidence that Islam is true, because you shouldn't believe something without any evidence for it. But then as a secondary, if they actually engage in that, then I would also offer, if you're going to claim that the Quran contains scientific knowledge, that it's a scientific book, then you need to explain the miracle of Allah throwing stars at demons trying to sneak into heaven. You need to explain the miracle of sperm being produced between the backbones and the ribs, and so forth. You need to explain the miracle of the earth being laid out flat like a carpet. You need to explain the miracle of the sun setting in a muddy pool of water. You need to explain the miracle of Dul Qarnayn finding the people who are so close to the sun at its rising point that they are being burnt as it tries to rise up, and they don't have cover, so they're very dark people. You need to explain all of these miracles of the Quran, and you can't say what Muslims usually say, and that's that it's metaphorical. Dul Qarnayn just saw that. It was just his perspective, and their claims of them being scientific, like the sperm is actually produced in the prostate. Well, great. That's not between the backbones and ribs either. So they don't hold up to scrutiny, and the Muslim needs to be consistent. They need to either say that the Quran doesn't make scientific claims, in which case they need some other evidence that Islam is true, or they need to address all of the passages which are vaguely scientific, not just the ones they want to address. Now, as far as where you can find me, of course, my YouTube channel is Reasoned Answers. I have regular live streams there, and I usually open the stream up for any Muslim who wants to come up and talk with us live. Usually we have a presentation, and then we open it up for live questions at the end. Less common, I put out scripted videos. I also run the David Wood archives, where I'm re-uploading David's content, so you can find me there as well.
And also people can find you from ihatehatun.com.
Yes. And reasonedanswers.com will work as well. That's my real website.
Okay.
And I do
Go on.
I do encourage any seeking Muslim who's actually interested in truth to think about this material. And if you're legitimately seeking, you can find my contact information and get in touch with me that way as well.
Yeah, I'll put the links in the description as well. I haven't done that, but I'll do that as well. And remember, I did express that there was a part-time stripper from Islamic Dawah gangs put a survey out asking people what would cause you to have doubt in Islam. 20% people who joined that survey expressed the scientific miracles. So that means when you speak with your Muslim friends, these 4 verses, we looked at only 4 verses, they will come up. So learn the arguments, listen them carefully so that you can debunk them easily. When you debunk them easily, now we need to provide alternative of Lord Jesus Christ. We want them to have doubts in Islam. We want them to walk away from Islam. We want them to walk away from Muhammad, but we want them to walk towards Lord Jesus Christ. So listen those arguments carefully and make use of them. You will see Mr. and Mrs. Muslims are running away from Islam.
Yes, definitely. And I think you also wanted some prayer requests or items of prayer. So, yes. So, first of all, I would say, pray for my ministry. Pray that it's able to reach Muslims, reach people who are open to hearing the material. It's great to have Christians watching. It's great to equip Christians, but pray that Muslims are seeing this material as well. And then the more personal request, I'd like you to request prayers for my wife. She has ongoing issues with chronic pain in her foot. Her name is Crystal. So pray for Crystal's chronic pain issues.
Yes, beloveds, please do remember him and his wife in your prayers. We do have people who actively pray for one another, so you will be covered within our prayers, brother. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining me tonight as well, helping us to think through this miracle of scientific errors in the Quran. There were new things we learned. There were things we refreshed, but by God's grace, we will put them in practice so that we can get to see people are running away from Islam and turning to Lord Jesus Christ. And thank you very much, everyone who joined us in the chat tonight. Thank you very much to my moderators who kept people in order. Really appreciate it. By God's grace, we will see you on another live stream or at Speaker's Corner. May Christ crucified silently with his love until we see you.